What if I told you that one of the most respected longevity doctors in the world, a man who has dedicated his entire career to figuring out how to help people live longer and better, has said on record that there is one form of exercise he would choose above everything else if he could only pick one? Not supplements, not a special diet, not some cutting-edge biohack that costs thousands of dollars. One form of exercise. And what if I also told you that most people either skip it entirely or they do it completely wrong, and because of that, they're leaving what might be the single most powerful thing they could do for their heart completely on the table? That's what this video is about. I'm going to walk you through exactly what Peter Attia says about exercise and heart health, what the science actually shows, why Zone 2 cardio, which is the cornerstone of his entire framework, is something he calls non-negotiable. And then I'm going to tell you how to actually do it, how long, how often, and what to watch out for. Because here's the thing, the concept sounds simple, but the execution is where almost everyone gets it wrong, including people who think they're already doing it. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to have a complete picture of what Peter Attia recommends, why he recommends it, and exactly how to build it into your own life. Whether you're 30 years old and trying to build a foundation, or you're 55 and feeling like you may have lost some ground, this information applies to. Let's get into it. First, let me give you a little context on who Peter Attia is, because if you're new to his work, you need to understand that this is not a guy who throws opinions around loosely. Peter Attia is a physician who trained at Johns Hopkins, did a surgical residency, then spent 5 years at the National Cancer Institute working on immunotherapy for cancer. He then moved into what he calls Medicine 3.0, a proactive, evidence-based approach to extending what he calls the health span, not just the lifespan. He has one of the most popular health podcasts in the world called The Drive, and he wrote a book called Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity, which became a massive bestseller. The reason his voice carries so much weight in this space is because he doesn't just read the research. He interrogates it, he applies it to real patients, and he applies it to himself. He trains hard. He tracks his own biomarkers obsessively. He's lived this stuff for over a decade. So when Peter Attia says that cardiovascular exercise, and specifically Zone 2 training, is the single most important pillar of his longevity framework, you should probably pay attention to that. Now, before we get into Zone 2 specifically, I want you to understand something important about how Peter Attia thinks about heart health and cardiovascular fitness, because it's not the way most people think about it. Most people, when they hear cardio, they think about burning calories. They think about losing weight. Maybe they think about their blood pressure number going down a little bit. And those things matter. But Attia's framework goes much deeper than that. He talks about cardiovascular fitness as one of the most powerful predictors of all cause mortality that we have access to, not just heart disease mortality, all causes of death. And the research on this is genuinely striking. There's a famous study that Attia references often. It looked at over 120,000 people and measured their cardiorespiratory fitness using a treadmill stress test. And what they found was that people in the bottom 25% of fitness had a mortality risk roughly 5 times higher than people in the top 25%. 5 times, that is a bigger risk factor than smoking. It's bigger than diabetes. It's bigger than hypertension. And yet almost nobody talks about VO2 max the way we talk about cholesterol or blood sugar. Attia thinks that's one of the biggest blind spots in modern medicine, and I think he's right. VO2 max, for anyone who doesn't know, is your body's maximum ability to consume and use oxygen during intense exercise. It's essentially a ceiling measurement of your cardiovascular and muscular engine, and it declines with age, typically about 1% per year, starting in your 30s, accelerating after about 50. But here's what's important: it is highly trainable. You are not stuck with the VO2 max you have. You can increase it, and Attia believes increasing it is one of the most important things any person can do for their long-term health. So where does Zone 2 fit into all of this? Let's talk about that now, because this is really the heart of the whole thing. Zone 2 is a specific intensity of aerobic exercise. When we talk about exercise zones, we're talking about different intensities of effort, usually defined by heart rate or by metabolic markers. Zone 1 is basically a walk, very easy, conversational, almost no real training stimulus. Zone 3 and 4 get moderately hard and hard. Zone 5 is all-out effort, maximum intensity. Zone 2 sits in a very specific place. It's the highest intensity you can sustain while still primarily burning fat as your fuel source, while still keeping your lactate levels low, below about 2 millimoles per liter, and while still being able to hold a full conversation. Though it's a little bit effortful, it's the sweet spot where your aerobic system is working hard, where your mitochondria are being trained and stimulated, but your body isn't being pushed into the kind of metabolic stress that requires long recovery. Peter Attia has described Zone 2 as foundational in a way that no other training modality is. And here's why: the adaptations that come from consistent Zone 2 training are remarkable. You are directly training your mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles inside your cells. You're increasing their number, you're improving their efficiency, you're improving the health of your cardiovascular system at a very deep level. You're improving your body's ability to clear lactate. You're improving insulin sensitivity. You're improving the function of your heart muscle itself. The left ventricle gets stronger. It gets more efficient. It pumps more blood per beat. Your resting heart rate goes down. Your stroke volume goes up. These are real, measurable, meaningful adaptations that happen specifically in response to consistent Zone 2 work over time. And Attia is very clear about something: these adaptations do not happen when you're working too hard. This is the counterintuitive thing that trips people up. Most people, when they go out for a run or get on a bike or jump on a treadmill, they go too hard. They spend their time in what's sometimes called the gray zone, not hard enough to get the high intensity benefits, but too hard to get the Zone 2 benefits. And they wonder why they've been doing cardio for years and aren't getting the results they expected. Zone 2 requires you to slow down significantly for a lot of people, and that's uncomfortable psychologically. It feels like you're not working hard enough. It feels like you're not doing enough. But the science says otherwise. Let me tell you what happens inside your body when you do Zone 2 training consistently, because I think understanding the mechanism makes it easier to commit to it. Your muscles are full of mitochondria, and those mitochondria come in different types, broadly speaking. Some are more efficient at burning fat. Some are better suited to burning glucose. When you do Zone 2 training, when you're working at that specific low to moderate intensity for extended periods, you're sending a very specific signal to your body that says, we need more fat burning capacity, we need more metabolic efficiency. And over time, your body responds by creating more mitochondria and improving the function of the ones you already have. Now, why does this matter so much for heart health specifically, because your heart itself is a muscle, and your heart runs almost entirely on fat as its fuel source. A well-trained heart, a heart that has been trained through years of Zone 2 aerobic work, is more efficient, more resilient, and better protected against the things that kill most people. Coronary artery disease, heart failure, arrhythmias, all of these are linked to the health of the cardiovascular system, and all of them are influenced by how well trained your aerobic system is. Attia also talks about something he calls the metabolic health connection, the idea that poor metabolic health, specifically insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, is deeply linked to cardiovascular disease risk. And Zone 2 training is one of the most powerful interventions for improving insulin sensitivity that we know of. When you train your mitochondria to be more efficient at burning fat, you're also improving your cell's ability to respond to insulin, which reduces the chronic low-grade inflammation that is so destructive to the cardiovascular system over time. So the picture Attia paints is this Zone 2 training doesn't just improve your heart health through one pathway. It improves it through multiple interlocking pathways: mitochondrial health, metabolic health, cardiovascular efficiency, reduced inflammation. That's why he calls it a cornerstone. Now I want to talk about the practical side of this, because all the biology in the world doesn't help you if you don't know what you're actually supposed to do. The first question most people have is, how do I know if I'm in Zone 2? And there are a few ways to figure this out. The simplest and most accessible method is what's called the talk test. If you can speak in full sentences, but it requires a little bit of effort. If you can hold a conversation, but you wouldn't want to recite a poem, you're probably in Zone 2. If you can chatter away effortlessly without any effort, you're too easy. If you're breathing too hard to complete a sentence, you've gone too hard. The talk test is imperfect, but for most people starting out, it's a surprisingly good guide. The more precise method is heart rate monitoring. Zone 2 for most people sits roughly between 60 and 75% of their maximum heart rate. The classic formula for estimating max heart rate is 220 minus your age. So if you're 45 years old, your estimated max heart rate is 175, and Zone 2 would be roughly 105 to 131 beats per minute. Now, Attia is the first to tell you that these formulas are imprecise. Individual variation is significant, but for most people without access to a metabolic lab, heart rate monitoring gets you into the right ballpark. The gold standard, which Attia uses with his patients, is lactate testing. You can actually measure blood lactate during exercise using a small finger prick test, similar to how a diabetic checks blood sugar, and you want to see lactate levels below about 2 millimoles per liter to confirm you're truly in Zone 2. This is more work, obviously, but if you're serious about dialing this in, it's worth knowing about. The second big question: what type of exercise should you use for Zone 2? And here's the good news: almost anything works as long as you can sustain the right intensity. Cycling, either on a stationary bike or outside, is one of Attia's personal favorites because it's low impact and easy to control the intensity. Running works well for people who don't have joint issues. Brisk walking, genuinely brisk, not a stroll, can get many people into Zone 2, especially those who are less fit. Swimming, rowing, the elliptical, all valid. The key is that you want to use big muscle groups, you want sustained effort, and you want to be able to maintain that effort for a long time without stopping. Here's where I want to talk about time, because this is the part that either inspires people or discourages them. Peter Attia's recommendation for Zone 2 training is roughly 3 to 4 hours per week. He often breaks that down as 4 sessions of 45 minutes each, or 3 longer sessions. And I'll be honest with you, when a lot of people hear 3 to 4 hours a week, their first reaction is something like, I don't have time for that. But I want to push back on that for a second. 3 to 4 hours over 7 days is about 26 to 34 minutes per day. If you work out 4 days a week, it's 45 minutes per session. And when you think about what those 45 minutes are actually producing, the mitochondrial adaptations, the cardiovascular improvement, the metabolic health benefits, it starts to look like an extraordinary return on investment. You're not doing anything high intensity. You're not torturing yourself. You're riding a bike or going for a walk while listening to a podcast. And you're potentially adding years of high quality life on the other end. Attia also acknowledges that 3 to 4 hours a week is the target for people who are training seriously. If you're just starting, even 45 minutes once or twice a week is meaningful. The research shows that the biggest gains come from going from no exercise to some exercise. Every step in the right direction matters. Don't let the ideal be the enemy of the good here. Now I want to address something that Attia talks about a lot, which is the relationship between Zone 2 and high-intensity training. Because some of you are going to be wondering, what about a HIIT? What about the high-intensity interval training that everyone was talking about for the last decade? Is Zone 2 better than HIIT? Attia's answer, and the answer of most serious sports scientists, is that it's not an either-or question. Zone 2 and high-intensity training produce different adaptations, and a complete cardiovascular training program includes both. But here's the catch. Most people are doing it backwards. They're doing almost all high-intensity work and almost no Zone 2. And that means they're missing out on the foundational aerobic base that Zone 2 builds. In endurance sports, there's a training principle called polarized training that Attia often discusses. The general framework is roughly 80% of your training should be in Zone 2, and about 20% should be in Zone 5, high-intensity interval work. Zone 3 and 4, that moderate, hard gray zone where most recreational exercisers spend most of their time, is actually the least effective use of your training hours for developing either aerobic efficiency or peak capacity. It's hard enough to cause fatigue, but not targeted enough to drive the specific adaptations you want. For heart health specifically, Attia also recommends what he calls VO2 max training, short, very intense intervals designed to push your oxygen consumption to its ceiling. This is typically done 1 or 2 times per week, in addition to the Zone 2 foundation. A classic protocol is 4-minute intervals at near maximum effort, with 4 minutes of recovery in between, repeated 4 to 6 times. This kind of training drives improvements in VO2 max in a way that Zone 2 alone does not. So the picture looks like this. Zone 2 is the foundation. It's the base of the pyramid. It's what you spend most of your training time on. And then high-intensity intervals are layered on top less frequently to push that VO2 max ceiling higher. I want to spend some time now on one of the things that Attia emphasizes that I think gets overlooked, which is the idea of tracking progress. How do you know if your Zone 2 training is actually working? Because one of the beautiful things about this approach is that the progress is measurable. You don't have to guess. One of the key markers Attia looks at is what he calls metabolic efficiency, specifically how much fat you're burning versus glucose at any given exercise intensity. When you first start doing Zone 2 training, If you're metabolically unhealthy or untrained, your body might start burning a lot of glucose, even at relatively low intensities. The goal over months and years of training is that you start burning a higher proportion of fat at higher and higher intensities. This means your mitochondria are becoming more efficient, your metabolic health is improving, and your aerobic base is growing. You can track this with lactate testing or with a metabolic test called a metabolic cart test, where you breathe into a mask and measure your actual oxygen and CO2 exchange. But even without that level of precision, there are simple things to look for. Your resting heart rate should go down over time. Your heart rate at a given workload, say at a walking pace of 3.5 mph, should decrease over months of consistent training because your heart is getting more efficient. At a given zone 2 heart rate, your pace should increase, meaning you're moving faster for the same metabolic effort. These are all signs that the training is working. Another thing Attia tracks closely in his patients is what happens to their metabolic markers. Their fasting glucose, their fasting insulin, their HbA1c, their triglycerides. All of these should improve meaningfully over 6 to 12 months of consistent Zone 2 training. He's seen dramatic reversals of metabolic syndrome in patients who committed to this approach. Not from a perfect diet, not from medication alone, from training their aerobic system. Let me talk about something else Attia is very specific about, which is the idea of progression. Because Zone 2 is not static. As you get fitter, what Zone 2 feels like changes. This is something that confuses a lot of people. When you first start, Zone 2 might be achieved with a brisk walk. Your heart might hit Zone 2 at a very modest pace, but as you get months and years of training into your body, your aerobic system becomes more efficient, and it takes more intensity to get your heart rate up to Zone 2. So what was Zone 2 at the beginning? That brisk walk might become Zone 1 for you a year later. You need to keep challenging yourself appropriately to continue getting the adaptation stimulus. This is why Attia really encourages people to use objective measurements rather than just perceived effort over the long haul. Your perception of effort changes as you get fitter, and that's a good thing. But you need to keep tracking the actual physiological markers to make sure you're still in the right zone. He also talks about seasonal periodization, the idea of cycling through phases where you focus heavily on Zone 2, then phases where you add more intensity. This is what competitive athletes have done forever, and Attia thinks there's real value in applying those principles to recreational training for health. I also want to address something that comes up a lot in discussions about Zone 2, which is the mental aspect of it. Because here's the thing, Zone 2 training can feel boring when you're used to hard, sweaty, intensely effortful workouts that feel satisfying in that tortured sort of way. Spending 45 minutes on a stationary bike at a pace that feels almost too easy can feel psychologically unsatisfying. You might feel like you're not doing enough, like you're wasting your time. Attia talks about this honestly. He says that Zone 2 is boringly effective, that it doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but the cumulative effect over years is profound. And he has a few practical strategies for making it sustainable. One is pairing it with something you enjoy consuming passively: podcasts, audiobooks, phone calls with friends. Zone 2 is actually the perfect intensity for this because you can talk and listen comfortably. The workout becomes time you look forward to for the content you're going to consume during it, not just the fitness itself. Another thing he emphasizes is the social dimension. Zone 2 is genuinely one of the best workout intensities for exercising with other people because you can actually hold a conversation the whole time. So if you've got a friend or a spouse or a colleague you enjoy spending time with, zone 2 walking or cycling together is actually ideal. You get the social benefit and the training benefit simultaneously. Now, I want to bring this back to the bigger picture because I don't want you to leave this video with just a training protocol. I want you to understand the philosophy behind it because the philosophy is what makes the protocol stick. Peter Attia talks about what he calls the Centenarian Decathlon. This mental model where you think about what physical capacities you want to have at the end of your life at 80, 85, 90 years old, and then you reverse engineer your training from there. Not what do I want to be able to do at 40, but what do I want to be able to do at 85? Do you want to be able to carry your groceries? Climb stairs without holding the railing? Play with your grandchildren on the floor and get back up without assistance? Take a walk on a trail? These things require a baseline of cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, and balance that has to be built and maintained over decades. The key insight, and this is the thing that really reframes how you should think about exercise, is that your peak physical capacity at 40 or 50 determines your floor at 80. If you are at a high level of cardiovascular fitness now, and that fitness declines at the average rate of about 1% per year as you age, you will still have meaningful cardiovascular capacity in your 80s. But if you start at a low level and never build it up, by the time you're 80, you may not have the reserves to handle even the normal physical demands of daily life, let alone the reserves to handle a medical event like a surgery or a serious illness. Attia is very clear. Cardiovascular fitness is not a vanity metric. It's not about looking fit. It's a survival metric. It's one of the most accurate predictors of whether you will die prematurely and one of the most powerful variables you have direct control over. Let me also touch on what Attia says about the combination of Zone 2 with strength training because he doesn't see these as competing priorities. He sees them as complementary pillars. He is emphatic that strength training is just as important as cardiovascular training for longevity, but for different reasons. Where Zone 2 is building your cardiovascular engine and your metabolic health, strength training is preserving muscle mass, bone density, functional capacity, and protecting against the frailty that comes with aging. The goal isn't to be a cardiovascular specialist or a strength specialist. The goal is to be a generalist in fitness, someone who has high cardiovascular fitness and meaningful strength and mobility and stability. All of it matters. But when it comes to the cardiovascular piece, when it comes to the question of what is the single most impactful thing you can do for your heart, Attia consistently points to that Zone 2 foundation. Build the aerobic base, train your mitochondria, improve your VO2 max, and do it for years, not weeks. Before I wrap up, I want to make sure I address the elephant in the room, which is this stuff takes time, not weeks, months and years. And I know that's hard to hear in a world full of 21-day challenges and 8-week transformations. But here's what Attia says about that, and I think it's genuinely worth sitting with. He talks about how the biggest health decisions you make are not the ones that affect how you feel next month. They're the ones that affect how you function at 80. The return on investment on Zone 2 training is real, it's measurable, but a meaningful chunk of that return is paid out in decades, not weeks. Your arteries in 30 years will be affected by the training you do today. Your heart muscle will be stronger or weaker, partly based on choices you're making right now. Your mitochondria, your metabolic flexibility, your VO2 max. All of these things have a long lag time, but they have an enormous eventual impact. That's not a reason to feel discouraged. That's a reason to start now, and to be patient, and to trust the process. Attia often says something like the best time to start training seriously was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And I think that's exactly right. Okay, so let me give you the practical summary, because I want to make sure that after everything we've covered, you can walk away with a clear, actionable picture. The cornerstone of Peter Attia's exercise framework for heart health is Zone 2 cardiovascular training. That means sustained aerobic exercise, cycling, running, walking, rowing, swimming at an intensity where your heart rate is roughly 60 to 75% of your maximum, where you're burning primarily fat, where your lactate is low, and where you can hold a conversation with some effort. You want to be doing this for roughly 3 to 4 hours per week, broken into sessions of at least 45 minutes each, because shorter sessions don't give the mitochondria the sustained signal they need to adapt. On top of that Zone 2 base, you add 1 or 2 sessions per week of high-intensity interval training, real, hard, near maximum effort to drive improvements in VO2 max. You track your progress over time by watching your resting heart rate go down, watching your pace increase at a given heart rate, watching your metabolic markers improve. You pair your Zone 2 sessions with something you enjoy listening to, and if possible, you find someone to do it with because it's social intensity friendly. You layer in strength training alongside this, not instead of it, to address the other pillars of longevity. And you think not about what this is doing for you right now, but about what it's building for the person you want to be at 80. Here's what I want to leave you with. We live in a time of incredible medical technology. There are drugs that can lower your cholesterol, drugs that can manage your blood pressure, drugs that can control your blood sugar. And a lot of people look at that landscape and think, well, if something goes wrong, medicine will fix it. And in some ways, that's true. But Peter Attia's whole argument, his entire career's argument, is that the most powerful medicine is the kind you don't need because you never got sick in the first place. Cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, many cancers, the risk of all of these is dramatically reduced when you have a high level of physical fitness and metabolic health. Not eliminated, but dramatically reduced. Zone 2 training is not a magic bullet. There is no magic bullet, but it is one of the closest things to a proven, accessible, low-risk, high-reward intervention that exists in the evidence base today. The research on it is overwhelming, the mechanism is well understood, the practical barrier to entry is low. You don't need a gym, you don't need equipment, you don't need a medical degree, you need time, consistency, and the willingness to embrace the idea that slow and steady is not just enough. It's actually what your biology is asking for. So go for a walk, get on a bike, put on a podcast, keep your heart rate in that zone, stay there for 45 minutes, do it 3 or 4 times a week, and do it for years. Do it not because someone on YouTube told you to, but because you understand what's actually happening inside your cells, because you understand that every one of those sessions is making your mitochondria more numerous and more efficient, making your heart stronger and more resilient, making your metabolism healthier, and building the cardiovascular reserves that you will be profoundly grateful for in 30 years. That's the message. That's what Peter Attia has been saying, and the science backs him up. If you found this useful, hit subscribe because we cover this kind of deep, evidence-based health content regularly. Drop a comment below if you have questions or if you're already doing Zone 2 training, I'd love to hear about your experience with it. And share this with someone you care about, because honestly, this is the kind of information that can change the trajectory of someone's health if they take it seriously. I'll see you in the next one.